Hello, and welcome back to the Nick and Jim podcast, A Little Wayward. Certainly we can do that. Good to have you back with us. Nick, good to be with you again.
Good to be with you, Jim.
And looking forward to where the conversation goes. These conversations, of course, are relatively unscripted. We usually try to have a sense of a rough roadmap of where we're going. So if we do end up being a little wayward,
it's all part of the name.
It's all part of the name, yeah. That's just part of who we are. Anyhow, good to be with you. How's your Easter octave going, Nick?
Oh, it's been really good. Just lots of time just being at home with family. Lots of time for board games, for cooking. Sourdough cooking, baking has been a bit of a success. A few flops here and there. Yeah, but it's been great. How's yours been, Jim?
It's been gentle. I think I was mentioning that my anticipation for Easter was simplicity was the word that was coming to mind. And certainly it's been very simple. And there's been a grace in that and a joy in that, because in that simplicity it provides the opportunity to reflect on what are the essentials in the moment to moment. What are the essentials? So there's been good. The words that were coming to mind this morning as I was reflecting on it were the words from the Psalm, be still and know that I am God. So in the midst of a lot of confusion and care, there is that stillness, and in the stillness, the presence of God. And it's very beautiful. So simplicities has been what's marked it.
Yeah, I like how you put it. In this time period, we're all kind of having to come back to the essentials. What is essential? What's nice to have? What's important? Yeah. And that's one of the real hard elements of this time period, but also one of the benefits. I think it's making all of us to go a little deeper into self-examination.
Yeah. It's funny, there was recently a reflection in Magnificat from Monsignor Lorenzo Albacete. And he's just saying in this time, especially in this Easter time, when we say Christ is victorious, death, where is your sting? Grave, where is your victory? Now, these are defeated foes. Satan himself is a defeated foe. And so often I realize that the hesitations, anxieties, concerns that can crowd and cloud my heart really are simply the shoutings of a defeated foe, a bully whose last defense or offense is just to shout and make loud noises. So often the storm that is in my heart is just that, the anxieties that I have. Albacete was saying, come back to the essential. The essential is like, if the battle is done, and it is done, we can't say it's waging, and we can't say it's the war is being waged or the battle is raging on. Christ is victorious, which means he's victorious now in this moment. And so for me to come back to that truth of Christ is victorious. So I realized that those times of hesitation in my heart, the simplicity, we come back to that if I am really entering into the simplicity, then those places of anxiety in my heart, I can stake the flag of Christ's victory, the cross, in hoc signis vinces, in the sign, Christ is victorious, and reclaiming parts of my heart for Christ and living in the reality of that. And that's about the Word becoming flesh. Sorry, I went on a little bit of a ramble there. Wayward.
No, we're sticking true to the name, A Little Wayward. But I mean, these are also little way words with an O. So I mean, it works great.
Yeah.
There's a lot of truth in what you're saying, Jim.
Yeah.
So I guess we could just segue right into what are we talking about today, Jim?
We're going to be speaking actually about Nazareth, a word that we throw around a lot.
Yeah, we use it a lot.
We talk living Nazareth, entering into the spirit of Nazareth, the Nazareth spirit, Nazareth family. It's one of these things where it's easy, I think, sometimes to actually not just put the brakes on and say, well, what do we mean?
Yeah, it's terribly easy for you and I to throw that word around. I think we've used it at least 7 times in our past 3 or 4 podcasts. So whenever I sat down with you the other day, just trying to figure out the topic for this podcast, I think it makes a lot of sense for us just to outline what we mean by it. Like here at St. Therese Institute, we're kind of immersed in Nazareth, or Nazareth Family Spirituality is the full title. So yeah, Jim, what would you say are, where does it come from? Where does it come from? Let's start there. Where does this term originate?
Yeah, sure, Nick. You know what? If I may just put a pin in that, here I'm going to go a little wayward again.
Okay, fair enough.
What I'd like to do is just offer a word of encouragement and gratitude an acknowledgement to this year's class of students that have really embraced a very difficult poverty and a difficult cross because of the current crisis of COVID, of having to return home. And it's been about a month now that I've been out there, and I've had the beautiful opportunity of connecting with folks and chatting with them and journeying with them. So I kind of on my heart that we speak about Nazareth because it's a bit of a reminder of that essential thing. But also just to affirm this year's students in particular. It's been beautiful to connect with all of the alumni of St. Therese, but this year's students particularly, this third trimester at St. Therese, which is a very beautiful time of really living in that family spirit and living in that community, has been really taken away, that experience taken away from the students. And yet, in the wake of that, God lets nothing go to waste. I was chatting with somebody just yesterday and realizing that this is an incredible opportunity, and it could be, and I believe it will be if we approach it with the right disposition of heart. For this year's students, it could be one of the most fruitful third trimesters ever, because in a very real way, the students have been, in a sense, invited, encouraged, forced to really live Nazareth and live the vocation to love in a way like no other students at St. Therese ever have in the third trimester. So it's like university level Nazareth living now. And so it's a beautiful opportunity. So just a word of thanks and affirmation and encouragement to the first year students, the second year students, and the apostolic year students from this year of 2019-2020. Right on, live it deeply. God bless you guys, praying for you, and just acknowledge that in your own circumstances, God is very present, and the living the way of life of St. Therese, that Nazareth spirit, is being transferred and transformed and transposed into those circumstances and can be lived deeply. So I'm with you in this. Yeah, anyway, so that was just on my heart to do that. So we've gone wayward.
Yeah, we've gone wayward 3 or 4 times now already.
All right, we'll bring it back. So the question at hand was?
We just said Nazareth. We said Nazareth's family spirituality, the spirit of the family. We threw St. Therese in there. Really just isolating, what are we actually referring to here? So it might be good maybe just to step into where does this come from? How recent is this in the life of the church? You know?
Well, I think it's insofar as the church is ever ancient and ever new, it is a reality that is both ancient and new. In fact, it was the
so it's
very
always been
origin
there.
of the church. It's been there from the very beginning. In fact, the very beginning. Mm-hmm. Maybe going a little wayward again, but just come at this from another approach. I think that the treasure of Nazareth is something that is really being discovered more recently. In recent years, decades in this past century, particularly with a focus in the church on rediscovering and re-emphasizing with new clarity and with a fresh impetus the role of the lay faithful in the church. And the normative state for the lay faithful is the state of marriage and family. And so the understanding of a family spirituality is key. And the family spirituality we would call Nazareth. But Nazareth, in fact, reaches out to all human beings, because that is the first experience that every human being has, is being born. Mm-hmm. And no matter how difficult the family environment or how broken the family environment is, there's still something of family that is experienced by every one of us. We speak about these fundamental human experiences. But the thing about a treasure is that something that is of incredible value can be hidden in one of two ways, I think. It can be hidden by being actually hidden and veiled in mystery and security and locked away. The other way that a treasure can be hidden is by being left out in the open, where it ends up being seen as something so common, so familiar, that it loses, or we seem to miss the import of what it actually is. And I think the latter is the case for Nazareth. It is something that is so common and so familiar in the true sense of the word, familiar, belonging to a family, that we've lost the understanding of what really is. And it can evade us, elude us, we can miss it on a day-to-day basis because it is one of these obvious things, and it's the blinding flash of the obvious to recognize the importance of it. I recognize I'm kind of carrying the conversation here, Nick, but to come back to the question of, well, where does it originate from? The understanding of Nazareth really has its origin as all community does, in the very beginning, when God said, "Let us make man in our own image, male and female, He created them." This notion of our own image has very deep significance. The term "our," and there's all sorts of different scriptural interpretations to what the "our" means. You teach scripture, maybe you can carry the ball for a little bit on that. That notion of what's meant by the "our" image.
Well, what's interesting is that the word used in Genesis refers to the word for God, which is El. But what's interesting is that the singular of El is, well, it's El, E-L. But when we get into the actual word that's used in Genesis, it's Elohim, which is the plural. And so this has baffled scholars for years, including Jewish scholars, including Islamic to an extent. What's fascinating is that in the ancient world, they thought that God was so important and so large and so uncontainable by everything in the world that they needed that one word, like the oneness, singularity, wasn't enough to capture His being. The singular, even though the Jews were very strictly monotheistic, the singular just didn't seem to capture the richness of the concept that was God. And so they used this word, our, to kind of describe this. But this is also something God says about Himself. And so then when we have Christ coming onto the scene, the Trinity, it changes. We see that, yes, God is one, but He is also three in some mysterious fashion. And so there's the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And one of the common ways in the Christian faith that we talk about the Trinity is that it is almost like this primordial family, that it is actually this exchange of relationships that mirror, in a way, the exchange of husband and wife giving birth to a son or daughter. Yeah. And so when we say that, when He says, let us make them in our own image, yes, each man and woman are made each in the image of God independently, but when they come together and actually give birth to a family, then they also mirror God in a very profound way in that action as well. It's not the only way, but it is a very profound way.
So there's that image of God in the Trinitarian understanding, that it is, as you said, the notion of the primordial family, meaning of the first order. Man and woman, Adam and Eve, were created in the married state, so we recognize that marriage is what's called a natural sacrament. It's the only sacrament that actually has its roots in the natural order, in the order that God had created them. So God created human beings in this covenantal communion of life and love that is a reflection of the Trinity. That's revealed in the person of Christ. So let us make man in our image is the Trinity speaking to itself in a real way. There's notions of the royal we, let us do this, or the notions of God speaking to the angels. But I think in the recent times, and particularly in recent teachings from the Church, John Paul II, especially theology of the body, this clarity of understanding that this is the work of the Trinity speaking as a Trinity, as a communion of life and love that is reflected in the normative state for human persons being in a family. Maybe in this time of isolation, we're encountering this even more deeply as we are having to pray together intentionally. We're not able to gather as a church family, but we are gathering as the domestic church, these small little communities of praying. There's an opportunity, as much as there may be a deep privation, in the graces of God, with every privation, with every encounter of a poverty, there's going to be a depth of richness. And I think the richness can be the rediscovery of the family as reflective, as an icon of the Trinity. So what about Nazareth? What does this have to do with Nazareth? Well, as you mentioned, with the incarnation, with the coming of Christ, the fullness of revelation of what was intended. So we see that Christ is actually born, the second person of the Holy Trinity is born into a family. And that is the family of Nazareth. That is the family of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. So when we speak about a Nazareth family, we're speaking about the lived experience at Nazareth. It's important to recognize that in Nazareth, and I mentioned earlier Monsignor Albacete, at the end of his reflection, he was focusing on this. This is about the victory of Christ and claiming the victory of Christ. We speak about the Word made flesh. The Word has been made flesh. You and I embrace what we call an incarnational theology. We want the Logos to walk, talk, live, breathe. It needs to be integrated into our lived experience. So it's about the making the Word flesh, allowing the Word to be enfleshed. So that's a proclamation of the gospel. In Nazareth, in the actual physical place of Nazareth, there's a sign that has one other word added to that. It's not just the Word became flesh, but it is here the Word became flesh. This now really starts to open up the mystery of what Nazareth is. When we live the spirit of Nazareth, when we live in a way that is in concert and in harmony with, and in fact reflective, or like following the image of the icon of the Holy Family, which is an icon of the Trinity, then we actually allow the Word to become flesh here in this moment. So what do we mean by Nazareth then? So we come back to it. A key thing of understanding Nazareth is the incarnation. Here the Word became flesh. And Jesus Christ living there, our Savior, our Messiah, God Himself, living in the simplicity and the humility of the family in Nazareth. And we're recalling the words of one of the disciples saying, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" Well, that's kind of how God works. He takes the least likely. He takes the humble, the poor, the little, the simple, and lets those be the instruments of the proclamation of His glory. Think of Our Lady's heart, the Magnificat. That emphasizes that. A key in this is the silence of Christ, and silence speaks loudly. In fact, one of the scriptural themes is to recognize that often that which is not said is of as great importance as that which is said. Which in a world which is so incredibly noisy, it's difficult for us to recognize that. So maybe that comes back to what we were saying before about be still and know that I am God. It's that stillness, that silence. So often in St. Therese we speak about the word from Catherine Doherty, Pustinia, that desert space. St. Therese would have spoken about the Carmel as the desert. In that stillness, in that space, it echoes and resounds loudly with the presence of God. We think of Mary, who pondered these things in her heart. That's an act of contemplation and silence. The last words that she spoke, recorded in the Gospels, were, "Do whatever He tells you." And that's the wedding feast of Cana, at the beginning of Christ's public ministry. And the rest of her life is spent unrecorded in the Gospels. There's that silence in the Scriptures from Mary, but she was simply doing exactly what she had professed, doing whatever He told her in the moment by moment. There's the image of St. Joseph, who a devotion to St. Joseph is growing leaps and bounds. But we know virtually nothing about Joseph from the Scriptures, certainly nothing from his words, because there are no recorded words of Joseph. So we have this incredible figure of the foster father of Jesus, the guardian of the Redeemer, chosen from before all time, spouse of Mary, living the fullness of this with all of the masculine genius, and he's absolutely silent. So too we have the silence of Nazareth. And this is the key for it. It's the 18 years of unrecorded history in the Gospels, where we have to say, well, what was Jesus Christ doing? We know the last thing that we hear of Him from His youth is about age 12, being found in the temple. And one of the last words He speaks there is to Mary and Joseph, saying, "Did you not know that I must be about my Father's business?" I think that expression from Christ resounds deeply for the next 18 years, because we don't hear anything else from Jesus until the beginning of His public ministry. So
until He reached the age of maturity.
18 years. But I think that those last words, kind of like Mary saying, "Do whatever He tells you," and then she does whatever He tells her. So too, Christ saying, "Must I not be about my Father's business?" is not like, I'm going to say this now at 12, and I'll get on with it at 30 years old. So the question really is, what is His Father's business? And I think this is part of the mystery. His Father's business was about making the ordinary way of life that we all live as sons and daughters of God, as creatures of a beautiful Creator. It's the ordinary circumstances of life, of love, of joy, of sorrow, of work, of play, of sleeping, of eating, of laughing, of crying. all of this ordinariness becomes supercharged because it is the work of the Father in his human family. And Jesus exhibited this by going back, after he says, "Must I not be about my Father's business?" going back and being obedient to Mary and Joseph and growing in stature before God and before man in the humble circumstances of Nazareth. And that is the very heart of Nazareth spirituality. The simplicity, the humility, the littleness, the humbleness, the recognizing that that which is common and familiar and ordinary is actually now charged with the grace of God and becomes the moment of encounter with God. This is what we mean by the duty of the moment. We mustn't focus so much on the doing of the duty of the moment as recognizing that we want to do God's will, but we only do that when we encounter the presence of God. So in doing what we're supposed to do when we're supposed to do it, we actually encounter the presence of God. And when we respond to that, living Nazareth in the simplicity, in the poverty, in the humility, in the hiddenness, and in the silence, in a very real way, we are living the gospel, proclaiming the gospel, but also becoming the gospel. This is part of the praying always. For we declare with our very lives and our actions in the humble circumstances of life as it is right now, embracing it with joy, even if we're feeling that sense of anxiety and fear, by embracing it with joy, encountering God in it, as St. Therese would say, the sacrament of the moment. We are actually professing with our lives, here, the Word became flesh. So even right here, Nick, you know, in being faithful to what we've been asked to do, which is to record a podcast and a reflection, which I recognize I'm pontificating a lot here right now. But
There's a lot to unpack.
that's okay. But this sense of right here being faithful to this. God is present here, and we acknowledge his presence, and in a real way, by bringing ourselves into that sacrament of the moment, we can say, here, the Word became flesh. And then this work, this life, this moment, is a proclamation of the gospel in a most tangible and profound way, which we will not be able to see with these eyes or hear with these ears, rather like the disciples on the road to Emmaus. When we acknowledge the hidden presence of Christ, he becomes unhidden, unveiled, made manifest. For where there is love, there's God. So Nazareth resonates so deeply with the vocation to love of St. Therese. So that's kind of the basic primer in Nazareth spirituality.
I feel like you just prepared like a little horse pill of Nazareth family spirituality, and to be shoved down the ear of every listener.
Well, hopefully shoved into the heart of every listener.
Yeah. That's where we hope it ends up. But usually those things go to the stomach. But anyways.
I think we're going to be coming to the stomach a little later on, living Nazareth through the gastrointestinal Nazareth.
We'll get to that.
The way to a man's heart, of course.
Yeah, the way to a man's heart is through the stomach. That's right. But there's a lot to unpack there, and I mean, I think it comes down to Nazareth family spirituality. Is very simple. For me, whenever I see it, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, Jim. It seems to me that this is to simply to praise the ordinary, in a way, in the sense of recognizing that God's presence is not just in the extraordinary actions we do, or these, we have all these tales of saints going and doing amazing things. St. Therese of Avila levitating, that's our image of a saint. St. Joan of Arc going and conquering France, kind of thing. We have these extraordinary images of what it means to be holy. But in essence, we see that all of the works and wonders of Jesus' ministry, those 3 years that he was active, which is in a remarkably short period of time for anyone so influential in the history of the world, this should not be viewed independently from those 30 years or 18 years of silence we have about his life. Because what I'm seeing in Nazareth family spirituality is that it's precisely in those pillars of simplicity and humility and obedience. Obedare means to listen. That this is the foundation and the core essence of what the spiritual life actually is. To perform your duties, to be in the presence of Christ, and that everything else after that is almost like a footnote. And of course we come and be refreshed in the sacraments as we receive. And it's funny because even thinking of like what good comes out of Nazareth, that famous statement by one of the disciples when they hear that a prophet has arisen out of Nazareth.
I think that was Nathaniel, wasn't
I think
it?
it was
Sitting under a
Nathaniel.
fig tree,
Yeah, it was Nathaniel. Sitting under the fig tree.
A man in whom there is no guile.
Yeah,
He says it like it is.
Yeah, exactly.
Speaking his mind.
Oh, exactly. It's really respectable. But even breaking down the word Nazareth, the root word is Nestor, which means shoot or branch. The Messiah is actually termed, the Messiah in the Old Testament is actually one of the messianic expectations has to do with there will be a branch or a shoot coming off of the stump of Jesse, referring to the Davidic line. So I think that this applies to Jesus Christ first and foremost, but I think it also just applies to our embracing the ordinary human familial. In there, our Nestor, our branch of our salvation is wrought. It's
interesting as you're saying that. It calls to mind John 15, which we so often speak about. As Christ says, "I'm the vine, you are the branches. The Father's the vine dresser. Abide in me." I think the heart of Nazareth is that abiding in the presence of Christ in the moment. I think it's important for us to not miss the fact that when we speak of Nazareth family spirituality, we can tend to associate the word family with spirituality more so than Nazareth. And so doing, I think we can actually miss what it's truly about. It really is not so much a family spirituality based on Nazareth. It is rather a spirituality based on the family of Nazareth. And so every one of us, by being a member of the mystical body of Christ, can enter into the mystery of the life of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph and have that affect our lives. So it's not just about what happens within a family setting. It is about recognizing that the family of Nazareth was teaching us what it is to be human. And it's the church's basic teaching on what a family is. A family is the basic school of love. So the family of Nazareth teaches us how it is to love. That translates into everything that we do. It's important to recognize too, important to recognize, and you're kind of alluding this to, that 18 years was not just, like a parenthesis in the mission of Christ. It is absolutely essential to the mission of Christ. That was, again, being about my Father's work. As I was reflecting on this, I think this is the common experience of so many young people. And frankly, so many not so young people. I can't wait until this changes, as so many young people grow up in their home environments, and it's like, I can't wait until I can leave here. In my own experience, so often I wrestle with that, I can't wait until something changes, this is not a part of my life, or that's not a part of this shift. And we have that sense of that future orientation, and we're missing the now. But I think we can actually take that human heart cry of it, I can't wait. I just can't wait until I leave, for example. And just by changing the emphasis of that heart cry, we can actually speak of what Nazareth is. I can't just wait until I leave. I actually have to live deeply now, because my living it deeply now will actually transform what happens when I am sent, when things do move forward, or when I leave. So Christ's life in Nazareth, of which we have no record, was profoundly him saying, I can't just wait until my public ministry. I must live deeply what I will proclaim then, now. Humility, obedience, littleness, simplicity. And why was it that the people came when Christ moved into his public ministry, that we missed him for who he was? He was not the Messiah we had anticipated, the words of the disciples on the road to Emmaus. We had thought that he was. Well, maybe that was because our lens was off and not recognizing that Christ's priest, prophet, and king, those three messianic offices embodied in his high priesthood, which we all participate in, was about living the ordinary with depth, with grace, with reliance upon God, with love, and living the vocation to love. So my encouragement then, for myself, for you, Nick, for all of the students of St. Therese, past, present, future, for all human beings, is live deeply the model of what the Nazareth family gave us. hiddenness, simplicity, littleness, because this is the victory of Christ in this world. Another way of framing that would be Jesus in the boat with the disciples, in the midst of the storm. Had they been fully aware and understanding that the presence of Christ with them was greater than any wave that might be breaking over the bow, that's the faith we're called to. That's the faith of Nazareth. And I think that's the mystery of it. Father Jacques Philippe, apparently, reportedly, in a visit to Madonna House, where they live very deeply and very much what's influenced most profoundly my understanding of Nazareth, the teaching of Catherine Doherty and the living of it in the community of Madonna House in Combermere. Reportedly, when Father Jacques Philippe visited there recently, he said, the only thing that will renew and heal the church is if the church returns to Nazareth. That struck my heart deeply. And I think that in this time of the COVID crisis, this is the mystery that is being permitted. This is a severe mercy that's being permitted by God, is that we are very really being sent to Nazareth. That notion I saw on Facebook of the churches are not empty, the church has been deployed. It is the domestic church. It is the little Nazareths all over the place where love is being manifest, where if we have the disposition of heart and the openness, and this is my encouragement to the students earlier, is live Nazareth. Make every moment a proclamation, whether you're doing the dishes, playing cribbage, having a conversation, doing board games online with Christian, whatever you're doing. Do it with intentionality, with openness and prayer. And then that becomes that silent proclamation of the fundamental reality of the gospel. Here, the Word became flesh.
Mm-hmm. No, it appears to me that Nazareth family spirituality is all about setting our foundation on solid rock. It's actually to have our foundation for everything we do, that everything might become a form of communing with God in prayer. It's actually, I think, a response to St. Paul's exhortation to pray always.
Pray always, yes.
Pray always. And it's to actually see everything as sacramental and needing to be in communion with God, to not have any reservations. Now, one thing that definitely, I think, can happen whenever you look at Nazareth spirituality is you can look at it and say, well, this looks like an awful lot like doing nothing.
Actually, I would say it's doing little.
It's doing very little, very well. That's right. One thing that I would perhaps say to that kind of a objection, if you will, is thinking of it in terms of those foundations, setting the foundations. If you have a bad foundation and then you get called to do some greater mission, which is always part of our faith, some great mission, if you haven't set it on that mission on the right foundation, then it's going to fall apart. In fact, in my study of the saints, I've seen Nazareth family spirituality being lived out in a profound manner in the beginning of any great calling, and even existing within the midst of a great calling. For example, Thomas Aquinas composed the Summa Theologica. He didn't do that to become a career academic. He was doing this out of faithfulness to just these little steps, and he was given great abilities to do that. I'm thinking again of St. Joan of Arc. She was just faithful. She received her call in the midst of her duties. She was worked on a farm, So I don't think that we should view this as, antagonistic to doing great things or performing great wonders, but that rather the Lord has to be the one to initiate and give these callings, and we just have to be receptive. And there's a lot of work to do, but it's not a matter of our doing primarily.
It's not a matter of our doing. And in fact, Nick, I might take it even a step further, at the risk of being a little bit controversial, or maybe not controversial as much as just calling for deeper pondering, a depth of it. I think we miss the mark, obviously, if we say that Christ in those 18 years of the hidden life, the hidden years of Christ, was simply him waiting until the time for the public ministry came. Then he could get about the great work of salvation. That's an obviously we would recognize that no, that's not what was going on. But I think we also miss the mark, or risk missing the mark, if we simply say that those 18 years were a time of preparation for his public ministry. I would say rather, actually, that those 18 years of the hidden life of Christ was the context for the public ministry. I know myself well enough that I can embrace the first notion that it's not just waiting to get on with the great work. Because we can. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought. We can do that. We can say we need to. It's the great call that we have. But even more than just the preparation of, if I'm not silent and still, but to recognize that the great call is really not the greatest work of God. It is the hiddenness. Nazareth is the great work of God. The being sent to do some great work, I think we can be very distracted by that, our human desire to do something great. And again, it comes back to we will miss who Jesus Christ is as the Messiah if we think it's about the greatness, about the public ministry. And I think we also lose the essence of what the real call of the lay faithful is, which is to live the ordinary everyday as a proclamation of the gospel by saying, here, the word became flesh. If we need a saint to really show us that way, I think Saint Therese herself, who living the little way, discovering it in the cloister and basically living a family life, a community life, and it is the co-patron of missions and missionaries. And she did not do anything great. There was no great call on her life other than the great call of the moment in hiddenness and in poverty. And in fact, we speak about the collaboration of the priesthood of the lay faithful and the priesthood of the ministerial, the ordained priesthood. We have to recognize that the ministerial priesthood is at service of the common priesthood or the royal priesthood of the lay faithful. So too, the great call is at service of the hidden life of Christ. In fact, all of Christ's public ministry, I believe, and this may be where the controversy comes in, and we have a conversation about this sometime, but all of Christ's public ministry was simply to bring us all to the first fundamental and primary call to live Nazareth. Maybe, just maybe, that's why at the very end of his public ministry, he said, "Woman, behold your son. Son, behold your mother." And he took him, John, the disciple, the faithful disciple who we're all supposed to imitate, took her into his home, his Nazareth. I think that was at the cross, Jesus saying, come on, guys, don't forget the blinding obviousness of this, which is it's about the ordinary, everyday. That's where sanctity is worked out. Mm-hmm. That's where salvation occurs, and that's where the Word becomes flesh.
No, I think that there's a lot of truth in what you're saying, Jim. And Nazareth family spirituality is not about supporting an activism, for example. And it's not about supporting a quietism. It's about actually precisely devoting ourselves to the life of Jesus Christ and recognizing that one part of his life is not to be divorced from the other or even subordinated in an inappropriate way. Mm-hmm. For example, I think you could say that Christ came to save his people, but his act of salvation was across his entire life. Yeah. The pathway is never simply oriented to just this one point, but it's actually more like entering into the same deep reality of what the incarnation is and the bridge between humanity and God at every moment. So anyways, I think that there's definitely a wider conversation to be had on that.
Yeah, as you say, this might be just a little power pellet for ongoing discussion, but I hope at least it might bring some notions and some ideas to light.
Yeah, no, and I think that might even turn into a broader discussion sometime for this podcast. But for now, I think it might be good to perhaps move on to our movie discussion, which I think may very well tie into some of the themes that we've been kind of touching off here. Discussing the movie of Rudy, was starring Samwise Gamgee. And I think it's been about a few days since I've watched that now, but I thought it was just a beautiful image of the dynamic tension that is inherent in a young person's heart in many ways. There's this tension before a challenge or an obstacle that Rudy has to encounter in this film. He wants to go join Notre Dame football. He wants to go to Notre Dame, yes, for the education, but primarily for playing football, because that's him and his family had loved football from Notre Dame, and particularly his father. So there's this tension between him and his father the entire movie, as he tries to go and apply and fail to the Notre Dame football team. And and it's just this testament to letting be and letting God be God, being still, letting God be God, but then also putting in the work and putting in the time and going after his hopes and his dreams, which it might even seem irrational in the middle of that. I thought it was beautiful for kind of showing those tensions. What did you think, Jim?
I think the word you use, tension, is perfect, because we speak about the dynamic tension, that tension that exists between our envisioned outcome, our hopes, our dreams, and our current circumstances. We're in the midst of a study of Christus Vivit, and certainly this is one of the things that the Holy Father brings us back to time and again, is our dreams, our hopes, our desires, and how often those can be truncated. And we see this in the movie where Rudy's desires to play football for Notre Dame, which on the surface are so far beyond anything that it's really possible given his circumstances.
Yeah, he's 5'0".
He's 5'0", and weighs 150 nothing or whatever. It's just he's this tiny guy, and yet with a big heart, and that's the mystery. So he's not willing to just let go of his dreams and hopes, but in the face of a lot of opposition, the reality of his circumstances, but even more so, the constant negativity of those around him. Even his father, which was a sad, beautiful, sad experience, because you could see that his father, who had experienced profound discouragement and disappointment from his own father chasing dreams, and he's kind of resigned himself to the fact that we're happy if we just settle with not having dreams. Don't chase dreams; it's just going to bring misery. And I could really understand where the father was coming from. Because it was just from his own pain, and so often discouragement is like a contagion because of people's pains and hurts. But Rudy doesn't. He focuses on his dreams, but he's not living in the future. And I think this ties in with the Nazareth. He recognizes that in these dreams dreamt in God, as Catherine Doherty described them, these hopes, these desires, these are worked out by the faithfulness in the moment, and taking it step by step, and is going to Notre Dame, is encountering the priest, and is going to Holy Cross. I also thought it was beautiful that he got to Notre Dame through Holy Cross. I think that was a beautiful expression, that our dreams always come to fruition through the cross, which may seem a little waywards, but it is the way. God writes straight the crooked lines. That was a beautiful, beautiful movie.
Mm-hmm. And actually, it's funny, because I think one of the most interesting parts of the movie, it was really a turning point for when his dream actually becomes something of reality, is when he's at Holy Cross and he's worked his butt off to get his grades up, and he's applied time and time again for Notre Dame. He's been there, I think, 1.5 years now, and he's applying for what is the last time. They don't take seniors, I think, Notre Dame in that time period. So if he applies this one more time and he doesn't get it, it's done. He can't go. So then he's in the chapel, just sitting down and praying, probably working some stuff out with the Lord. And then the priest who actually admitted him to Holy Cross walks around. And he's like, "Oh, what's going on?" And he describes his predicament. And the priest says something I'll never forget. He says, "Rudy, in all my years of studying theology and teaching, there are only 2 incontrovertible facts that I have come across, which is that there is a God and I'm not him." And so it's precisely let God be God, and let him work in the way he works, and it's going to happen not in your own time. So Rudy, you could just see him kind of just puzzling over this once the priest leaves, and the priest kind of walks away with a bit of a smile, I think, knowing what kind of a seed he just planted.
Yeah.
And it's from that point forward, like, he goes, he receives his admission to Notre Dame, but he doesn't open the envelope at first. He tucks it into his books and just calmly walks out of the building, and then he goes, sits down on a bench in the middle of this park. You could almost say this garden. And then he calmly opens it, just trying to be detached, allowing God to be God. And it's when he does that he actually gets what he desires. So I thought that was a beautiful lesson, especially for me as a young person. I have my own dreams, my own desires, and I've got my own ideas of what I would like to do in life. Yeah. And it's the amount of times it's funny, where I've had to do that kind of a moment, and then all of a sudden, okay, now you can have it. God goes like that. Sometimes it can seem a little sadistic, but it's. I think it's appropriate. It's all about timing.
The 3 ways God answers prayer. It's never yes or no. It's yes, not yet, or I have a better plan for you. I love that notion of it. And you see that in Rudy. The priest character is amazing. There's the accompaniment that I see happening throughout this film of the church. There's another little one that caught my attention this time. The quote that you say, that's a great one. But there's one moment where Rudy's in there and he's just pouring his heart out and he's just frustrated. He says, I've tried everything. And you see the priest just kind of cock an eyebrow go. And then the next scene, you see him you see Rudy on his knees in front of a little grotto to Our Lady. It's like, yeah, everything except prayer. So you can see that very simple, gentle call to prayer. The other thing that really struck me in watching the movie this time was the sense of the communion of the saints at the end, where it was all of the football players of Notre Dame. Rudy was on the team, but he was not playing. He was on the practice team. But it was his greatness of heart, his magnanimity, his greatness of spirit that really caught the attention of all of these great big football players, to the point where they recognize that he is one of us. And the last game of the season, total spoiler here, but hopefully everybody's seen it, last game of the season, going to the coach and just laying their jerseys down saying, I want Rudy to play in my place. I want Rudy to dress in my place, like that. And I thought, this is amazing. This is like the communion of saints coming before the coach Christ and saying, look at this one. Look at this one. So I think we live the little way with great spirit. We may look at these saints and, there's these great saints that we pray to. It called to mind a reflection from someone, I can't remember who, but recently saying, when we stand before the judgment seat of God, when we stand before the glorious throne of God, not so much the judgment seat, but when we're in heaven, these great saints that we have prayed to and we've had devotions to all of these years, the St. Francis of Assisi's, the St. Francis Xavier's, the St. Therese of Avila's, St. John's of the Cross, even more recently, St. John Paul II, these great heroic saints who we've seen as these giants on God's football team. They're going to be the ones coming saying, but you were a saint in those days. There's that notion of like, yeah, we were fighting the beast, but you faced the beast face to face. We just don't see it. We're just trying to do our little bit of Nazareth. So I think I could see the communion of saints. And imagine what it would be like, Nick, if you had St. Francis going and laying his jersey down in front of Christ saying, I want his hair shirt. I want Nick to dress for me. That's the communion of saints. I think it's so beautiful. I was just really struck by that.
As long as I get a different hair shirt, I'm fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Beautiful. So do we have another suggestion for a movie next?
Why, yes, we do. The next movie we're going to talk about is something called The 100-Foot Journey. 100-Foot Journey, it's produced by Steven Spielberg and Oprah Winfrey of... I didn't know she produced films before this one. And it's a beautiful little movie. The setting is an Indian restaurant parked in front of a Michelin star French restaurant in the middle of France, which is known for its food culture. Yeah. It's a really good one. I've watched it probably 4 or 5 times now, and I just don't get sick of it. I always get hungrier the more I watch it, actually.
Well, I think the hunger is an important thing because, of course, the way to a man's heart is through the stomach.
So, that's right.
What I wanted to suggest is, as we watch this film, it might be interesting to have some cuisine to go with it. So you guys, if you track it down and have the chance to watch it. So I've asked Christian if he would post some recipes to accompany this movie viewing. Maybe the butter chicken, if I could suggest. Yeah, some butter chicken, and maybe some naan bread, some East Indian cuisine to go with watching this. Thank you, Christian. That's great. A little bit of curry on the side. Yes, it's always good to have some good food to accompany the movie. One of the things that I love about this movie is you see this clash of cultures, clash of expectations, but also clash of hopes and dreams that happen, and there's a tension. As I was thinking about this movie, it reminded me, I think, again, we've got a great one to accompany Christus Vivit as well. So I might suggest this as lenses through which to watch this movie. I haven't bounced this one off you next, see what you think of this one. But in chapter 3, which we're currently reading, or have just read, Article 80, the Holy Father says, "Some young people find family traditions oppressive, and they flee from them under the impulse of a globalized culture that at times leaves them without points of reference. In other parts of the world, even more than generational conflict between young people and adults, there is mutual estrangement. Sometimes adults fail or do not even try to hand on the basic values of life, or they try to imitate young people, thus inverting the relationship between generations. The relationship between young people and adults thus risks remaining on an affective level, leaving its educational and cultural aspects untouched. What harm this does to young people, even though some do not notice it. Young people themselves have remarked how enormously difficult this makes the transmission of the faith in some countries without freedom of speech, where young people are prevented from attending church." So point being, just this notion of family traditions and cultural traditions and how those work against, can oppose, can put tension on, or can actually fulfill the dreams and hopes of young people. And I think there's a beautiful narrative throughout this film of tradition, cultural traditions, youthful aspirations, and the tensions that come up from that. So maybe that might be just a point of reference for viewing this film too, as well as the food is good.
Oh yeah, no, there's all of that in that film and more.
And more.
I mean, there's even a love story. It wouldn't be France if there wasn't a love story involved.
So there we go, a foodie film of faith.
There we go. The first of many, I hope.
The first of many.
The first of many.
Wonderful.
So Jim, I have a few questions. What are your thoughts on?
What are your thoughts on?
That part of the show. So here I have a couple questions just from students and anyone really who wanted to submit a question to the podcast. So I have one question from Callista Nugent. She asks, what are some books that are helpful for vocational discernment? I might even tweak that question a little bit and just say, what are some just helpful resources to help with your vocational discernment? Maybe make it a little broader.
Oh, sure. Well, I think the most obvious one right off the top is the Holy Bible. Encounter the Word. It's a living Word. It's a living and active Word. The verse that particularly comes to mind insofar as vocational discernment is Romans 12, verses 1 and 2. Allowing yourself to have that transformative encounter with Christ in the Word of God, so that you might be able to discern what is the good, holy, true, perfect will of God for you in your life. Remembering that the first vocation is the vocation to holiness. That's the universal vocation. That's all of us. And then secondly is how that's going to walk out. Maybe back to our conversation of Nazareth, just that living intentionally in the moment, wherever you are, is not just waiting for the great vocational call, nor is it a preparation for the vocational call. It can actually be a living now of that vocational call. And when the deeper call comes, then there'll be the responsiveness to it. So the Holy Bible. Other ones that come to mind, I would suggest the Church's documents on the three great vocational states. So Christa Fides Laici for the lay faithful, that would be a great one to go to from John Paul II. The one Vita Consecrata on religious life, and was it Pastoris Dabo Vobis? I always stumble over that one. For the ordained, the formation of the ordained. Those are all documents that came out of the Synod of Bishops, so I think they're very timely and very Spirit-led. Insofar as other books on vocational discernment, there's a bunch of them that are out there on the specific vocations. I think start with those ones and then follow the Spirit's lead. He'll provide you with other resources as necessary. Good spiritual direction would be important on that too. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think when you're discerning something, it's good to know what you're discerning. Is kind of what I'm getting from your suggestions there.
Yeah. And to ground yourself in the encounter with Christ. There's no point about listening for a call if you're not listening to the person who's calling. So maybe that's a less than satisfactory answer.
Well, I think there was at least 4 books in there.
4 books, yeah.
So.
Maybe not the ones that were expected, but I think those are good. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's the foundation. A question for you then, Nick, a serious one too, and particularly in this time. This one from Christina Denis. Nick, is there a difference between God permitting something and God willing something? He's given us free will, and bad things happen to good people. So are those bad things in his will for us?
Well, this comes down to the distinction between God's active will and his permissive will. There's always, or his preferential will, I would say, maybe with St. Ignatius there. There's probably a few other distinctions that I'm not bringing up at the moment. But there's always the will that God has for us, which is his preference. This is what he really wants us to do, or to be, really. He wants us to be fully children of God every moment. And this extends even back to the Garden of Adam and Eve, where he wanted them to trust him and not take the fruit of the tree. But he did permit them to err, not because he wanted them to end in that way, but because he wanted to respect their free will. So this is actually a very big question, in other words. What I would say in the current context of an everyday Christian life, there are those pathways which God wants us to take, and those pathways which he will permit us to take within the life of devotion. So for example, he might want me to, do a holy hour in the morning, but he'll also permit me, and it wouldn't be outside of his favor, to sleep in one morning. But it's never about just wanting to, do the bare minimum. It's always about trying to show up to be with God in prayer and to be serving him as best I can. In terms of the question of suffering, this is a very big one. And suffice to say, all of suffering, I would say, takes place in God's permissive will. He doesn't actively desire our suffering directly, ever. Because this is a privation. This is a poverty. He doesn't want us to be in poverty. He wants us to be rich in being. He wants us to be rich in consolation. He wants to be with us and to be sharing in his life. I came that you might have life and have it abundantly, says Christ. But that being said, so he does permit suffering to come across our paths as disciples. I would say primarily to unite ourselves to the suffering Christ, to understand what he went through for us. And I would even argue that partaking in suffering, we actually comfort Christ in some way. We say, we're here with you, Christ. Suffering can also be redemptive by taking upon suffering upon ourselves in the Christian life. We actually serve expiation for sins of ourselves and for others, So even though God permitted this poverty to happen, this poverty of suffering, he is precisely redeeming it as well. This is redemptive suffering in the Christian life. So God does not actively desire our suffering, but he has a purpose for it, especially in a fallen state. So that's what I would say is probably the beginnings of a response to that. It's a far bigger question, though. I don't know if you have something to add there, Jim.
Just the thought that comes to mind, maybe this is because we were just talking about food and the 100-foot journey.
Oh, yeah.
An interesting notion, I can't remember where it was from, I think it may have been Father Wilfrid Stinnison in his book, Into Your Hands, Father, on abandonment, where he says, the greatest gourmet chef is going to be able to take the most rotten ingredients, or like the poorest ingredients, and prepare a great food, a great meal out of it. That's what a great gourmet is able to do, a gourmet chef. God can take rotting ingredients. He can take, the worst things and work it. And I think that's the thing. We tend to juxtapose good and evil as if they're equal, a kind of a yin-yang thing. We have to recognize that Christ has triumphed. He's victorious. So God only permits these things, as Augustine tells us. God only permits these things because he can work an incredible good out of it. So, yeah. Another question for you, Nick. And this is just a nice little Nazareth question for you from Natalie Godin. What is the newest thing Rosé has said, that has surprised you?
Oh, I can't say it on air.
All right, what is the second most new thing?
Yeah. Oh, gosh. She said the other day, look at that. And I was just like, where did you get that? Like, I don't even really say that all that much. I don't know. She's taken to imitating our local parish priest recently. She'll put her hands together and in prayer, and she'll say, Father Pius. That's terribly adorable. She'll also sing the Hosanna, which is kind of funny. Yeah, I don't know. I think that those are two of the most interesting things. Other than, she picks up a word and vocabulary where I'm not sure where she got it from, and I begin to question how I've been speaking in frustration around her. But anyways.
Beautiful. Cool. I think I just went out of turn. I asked you 2 questions in a row there.
Oh, that's fine.
All right.
I'll ask you, maybe this will be our last question.
Sure.
And this is one coming from Isaac Burke. Who is your favorite pope?
Oh, who's my favorite pope? Mm-hmm. Oh, gosh. Well, I think John Paul II, of course, probably closest to my heart because, most of my adult Catholic life was in his pontificate and the incredible teaching. I do really, really appreciate and love Pope Francis too. There are challenges to that, many head scratching that happens, and yet I see in him a witness of love. Of love. So I like Pope Francis a lot, but I think Pope John Paul II is Pope Saint John Paul II, the great, to be doctor of the church someday, I'm fairly certain. Yeah, he's probably my favorite.
Yeah, hard to beat.
Hard to beat, yeah. That's beautiful.
Well, I guess now it's come time for the last word.
The last word, yeah.
So,
what I'd like to actually do on this one is I think I've been done speaking a lot this one, so I actually just will bypass the rock, paper, scissors. I give it to you. I concede. It's yours.
Okay, thanks, Jim. No, some podcasts will probably just be like that, that one of us will probably have more to say, and other times it'll be less, and that's fine. But I will take the last word. I don't think I've done the last word yet, so this is exciting. Almost don't know what to say. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in with us. It's been a real joy to have everyone listen in. Keep on living the little way and just clinging to the Lord in these times. Both Jim and I know, because we've experienced various anxieties and various questions that come up, but both Jim and I also know just the many joys and opportunities that are in this time. In many ways, we've got our marching orders as we go forward, to engage deeply with the Lord and to have opportunities for leisure, contemplation, and just devotion. So thank you so much for tuning in, as I said, and God bless.